a ridge will be the main focus for weather over the next 2 weeks because the placement of the ridge will either bring us record or almost record high temperatures at times, but also a active pattern as the ridge begins to break down. As the ridge strengthens next week into the upper Midwest, that will allow for temperatures to rise into the 90s, at times even close to 100 degrees during the afternoon hours, and then in the overnight hours, near record warm lows are expected, with lows being in the mid 70s at times. And as we can look at by looking at the mid-level heights, as we get to this weekend and into next week, this ridge really begins to develop into the upper Midwest as well. And then with a pretty far northern placed ridge, this will bring a drier pattern for the most part through middle of next week. But as this ridge begins to break down, as we get to the end of next week and into the week after next week, especially, it will expand south, and this will allow for a ring of fire pattern to develop into the upper Midwest, into the Corn Belt region, into portions of the Great Lakes, because of the northern edge of the ridge pushing further south. That will allow for complexes of thunderstorms to ride along this northern edge of the ridge in a pretty dominant northwest flow. It is a pretty common upper air pattern for this time of year, where you have these complexes, even derechos, riding along the northern edge of these ridges, where the gradient of moisture and temperatures are in place. Interestingly, as we get into next weekend and into the week after next week, we start seeing some troughing showing up. The blue areas is troughing showing up into the Midwest, with a northwest flow in place, with some ridging in the southeast and into the west. This is a classic pattern for these complexes to be long lived and intense into the upper Midwest. So definitely looking at like that's gonna happen the middle of next week through the week after next week, probably through the end of July, with the troughing coming in place. This may allow for slightly cooler temperatures to take place as well, but it is July overall, so if I'm talking about cooler temperatures, it's going to be in the 80s probably. It just probably shouldn't be close to 100 degrees. Taking a look at the dew points as we head into next week, this is early next week. Dew points look to be only in the 60s, maybe at times we could push 70 dew points, but I do think that with that more of a northwest flow component, that dew points will struggle to get very high, and this is mainly driven by corn sweat up here in the upper Midwest, because all this ridging is a lot of sinking air that does allow for dew points can be lower at times in the northwest flow, but again, corn sweat could at least increase the dew points up into the 60s, maybe close to 70 degrees at times during peak heating, where the corn is really sweating. But yeah, I mean, to next week, let's say, I mean, the dew points again, for being July standards, this isn't that impressive. It's not going to be the 80 dew points that we experienced in the last heat wave at all. But as the ridge begins to break down into next weekend, in the northwest flow changes a little bit, the dew points will probably be getting back into the 70s again, more consistently. That's gonna allow for a lot more humid conditions as we get back into next weekend and into the week after next week. But again, it is July overall. It's gonna be humid regardless what happens. Looking at the mid-level winds, the mid-level flow, this and as we get into next week, you can see that ridge showing up into the upper Midwest, with the jet stream being pretty far north up into Canada as we get for early middle next week. That will allow that drier pattern to take place. But as we get into later next week, you can see that we start seeing this jet stream pushing further south because of the ridge. The ridge is starting to weaken and pushing further southwest to the desert areas that will bring them complexes of thunderstorms as we get. It looks like as soon as we get to next Thursday or so, we can start seeing them complexes happening. So only about a week out from that, and then a pretty consistent broad northwest flow looks to be in place pretty much through the rest of July. And when you get these embedded short waves in this northwest flow, that is when you can have a more potent severe weather event to take place, the more intense complexes or events of tornadoes as well. But as you get to this time of year, the tornado threat really starts to go down as more of them damaging wind events into the Corn Belt region, because you have them very rich low level dew points in place with obviously usually a broad northwest flow on the northern edge of a ridge that would be in place. Taking a look at the temperatures for next week as we get, so these are actual temperatures, not heat index. So next Tuesday, you can see widespread temperatures in the 90s expected, with close to 100 degrees at times as well, especially as you get into the plains areas next Tuesday. As you get into next Wednesday, you can see temperatures are still in the 90s as well, close to 100 degrees as you get to, and then these are the lows for the most part next Thursday. Next Wednesday night lows. For the most part, lows in the mid 70s, upper 70s to even 80-degree lows, which is still pretty impressive for this time of year. Next Thursday, you can see temperatures are still in 90s into the same areas. Next Friday, temperatures are in the 90s as well in the same areas in the Corn Belt. As you get to next Saturday, the same thing. And finally, as this ridge begins to break down, we can start seeing temperatures start cooling back off, with highs next weekend back into below average at times into the upper Midwest, but it's going to stay warm. To go further south, very warm further south, but the cooler temperatures won't last as long as what I forecasted back in the end of June, but that is because there's a lot more ridging than expected this month. That sets up into the Midwest. Taking a look at the ensembles for next week for precipitation compared to normal, very dry conditions is what this shows into the entire Midwest. That is going to happen because of that ridge in the upper Midwest. But as we get to next weekend and into the week after next week, you can see that the ensembles are finally starting to show precipitation being close to normal or even going above normal as you get further into the week after next week, into the Corn Belt region. You can start seeing above average precipitation. So it looks like we do get back into a pretty active pattern as after the middle of next week. And here's a look at another ensemble, the GFS ensembles. Next week, a very dry pattern overall, a very similar look as the other model I just showed. As we get into the week after next week, this model still is pretty dry compared to normal, but it starts getting wetter in that. But ensembles are usually pretty slow to a long range pattern change that will take place. So I would expect that these ensembles continue to show a wetter and wetter pattern as we get back to next weekend and into the week after next week. Below is a look at one models. Look at thunderstorms for next week. As we get into next week, you can start seeing these complexes that was. Well, hold on, I need to change my run. These complexes that will start to move through by next Wednesday. By next Wednesday, you can start seeing these complexes happening. Then by next Thursday, you can see them taking place into the upper Midwest. And as the ridge begins to break down to next Friday, you can see these complexes are further south and more expansive as that ridge breaks down later next week. And into next Saturday as well, you can see a pretty widespread thunderstorms with severe weather. And by next Sunday, the same thing, but a little bit further south. And then as we get to the week after next week, it looks similar as well. So it is just interesting seeing model guidance showing this ring of fire pattern. Starting to now, because a few days ago they didn't really have this much at all, even though it was pretty obvious that it was going to happen. But now they're starting to show the more active pattern as well for thunderstorms. So we get to the end of next week and to the week after next week. But at first, I wouldn't be surprised if these complexes happening further north in the upper Midwest, and then as the ridge breaks down, it begins to move further south. The thunderstorms move further south with it because the warm front will also move further south. This time of year is pretty obvious that the environment will be very unstable. But taking a quick look at this before I wrap this up, that we're going to have a pretty unstable air mass being in place later next week as dew points get back up into the upper 60s. You can see the higher CAPE values as we get into next weekend, but at times we don't really have much CAPE in place next week because of them low dew points, which isn't normal this time of year. July is usually very humid, so as you can see, the CAPE values increase once you get an increase in dew points as well. That's pretty simple math. So, I mean, if these complexes happen later next week, they will thrive for a long period of time.